Part 1, The Dream and the Voyage, 1451 to 1492. Imagine the smell of salt and tar, the creak of ropes in the wind, and the endless roll of the Atlantic beneath three tiny ships. Before that momentous crossing ever began, it all started with a dream, one stubborn man who refused to believe the world ended at the edge of the map. Christopher Columbus was born in 1451 in the bustling port city of Genoa, Italy, a place of merchants, sailors, and bold ambitions. As a young boy, he watched ships drift over the horizon and vanish into mystery. The Mediterranean was a world of trade and danger, of fortunes made and lost. From the docks, Columbus heard stories of golden lands beyond the sunset. Those whispers planted a seed that would grow into one of history's most fateful obsessions. The 15th century was an age of maps drawn with imagination as much as ink. To Europeans, the known world stretched from icy Scandinavia to the deserts of Africa, from Iberia to the far edges of Asia. Beyond lay the ocean sea, vast, terrifying, and unknown. Mariners feared it as a realm of sea monsters and endless storms. Yet, for dreamers like Columbus, it was the final frontier. He was not born into nobility. His father was a wool weaver, his mother kept the household. But young Cristoforo Colombo, as he was known in Italian, learned to read, calculate, and navigate by the stars, rare skills for a man of his station. He worked aboard merchant ships, sailing as far as Ireland and possibly Iceland. He survived pirates, shipwrecks, and long months at sea. The ocean hardened him and taught him patience, a trait he would desperately need later. As he matured, a single question consumed him: could a man reach the riches of Asia by sailing west? At the time, Europe's appetite for spices, silk, and gold seemed insatiable. But Muslim powers controlled the overland routes, and the Portuguese dominated the long, dangerous passage around Africa. Columbus believed there was a shortcut, across the Atlantic. The idea wasn't entirely new. Ancient scholars had suspected the earth was round for centuries. What made Columbus different was not the theory, but his math. He drastically underestimated the earth's circumference, believing Asia lay only a few thousand miles west of Europe. In truth, an entire unseen continent stood in the way. But to Columbus, the math looked like destiny. He first took his idea to Portugal, then the most powerful seafaring kingdom in Europe. The Portuguese court listened politely, and then rejected him. Their own explorers were already rounding Africa's Cape of Good Hope, they didn't need his wild gamble. Disappointed but not defeated, Columbus turned to Spain. Spain, newly united under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, had just completed its centuries-long reconquista, driving the Moors from Granada in 1492. The monarchs wanted wealth, glory, and souls for Christianity. Columbus's plan offered all three, if it worked. Still, the Spanish advisors hesitated. His estimates seemed absurdly low, his promises dangerously high. For 7 long years he waited, pleaded, and negotiated. He nearly gave up more than once. Then, in the spring of 1492, fate turned his way. The fall of Granada freed Spain's coffers and attention. Queen Isabella, moved by faith or by ambition, finally agreed to fund the voyage. On April 17, the capitulations of Santa Fe were signed. Columbus would sail west under the Spanish flag. If he succeeded, he would be titled Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and receive a share of the profits. For a man who had once begged for a single ship, it was an astonishing victory. He prepared 3 vessels, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They were not mighty warships, just small caravels and a clumsy carrack, crewed by fewer than 100 men. Most were sailors from the Andalusian port of Palos, some criminals spared prison in exchange for service. They were promised riches, but many feared they would never return. The ocean beyond the Canary Islands was a void no one had crossed and lived to describe. On the dawn of August 3, 1492, the ship slipped out of Palos harbor. Bells rang, families waved from the shore, and the sails filled with wind. As land faded behind them, Columbus wrote in his journal, "We left the port bravely, and our hearts were strong." He believed God himself had chosen him for this mission. For the first weeks, spirits were high. The Canary Islands offered a brief stop for repairs and supplies. But once they left those islands behind, there was only blue water and sky, and the unknown. The ocean seemed endless. The days blurred together, wind, waves, creaking wood, and the smell of salted fish. Columbus kept 2 logbooks, one true, one false, to deceive his crew about how far they had gone. He knew that fear was as dangerous as any storm. At first, signs of land gave hope. Pieces of floating vegetation. A carved stick. Birds flying west at dusk. But the days kept passing, and no land appeared. The men grew restless. They whispered that the admiral was mad. They wanted to turn back. Columbus stood firm. He gathered them on deck, eyes burning with conviction, and swore that land was near. By faith and by courage, he told them, "We will find the Indies, or die at sea." Then, in early October, the compass began behaving strangely. The needle no longer pointed true north. The sailors panicked, the heavens themselves seemed against them. Columbus, sensing mutiny, calmed them with explanations about shifting stars. In truth, he was frightened too. But he never showed it. Night after night, the sea stretched on. Then, on October 6, one of the ship's captains, Martin Pinzon, claimed to have seen birds heading southwest. Columbus ordered a change in course. Tension filled the air. Every creak of wood sounded like a heartbeat. Men scanned the horizon until their eyes burned. On the night of October 11, the moon rose red and swollen. Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, gazing west. He had promised that if no land appeared within 2 days, they would turn back. The men murmured prayers, some cursed his name. Then, just after 2 a.m., a cry shattered the silence. "Tierra! Tierra! Land!" Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor aboard the Pinta, had seen it first, a faint dark line on the horizon. The men rushed to the rail, shouting and weeping. Columbus fell to his knees, tears mixing with sea spray. He thanked God for delivering them across the ocean. He believed he had reached the islands off Asia, the Indies. As dawn rose on October 12, 1492, the 3 ships anchored before a lush, green shore. Palm trees shimmered in the light, waves rolled gently over white sand, and curious figures stood watching from the beach. Columbus, dressed in his finest clothes, raised the royal standard of Spain, and stepped onto the sand. His men followed, planting a wooden cross. They named the island San Salvador, Holy Savior. Columbus knelt and kissed the ground. Behind him, the waves hissed like a sigh of relief. Before him stood the people of this new world, the Taino, unaware that history had just changed forever. He thought he had reached Asia. In truth, he had stumbled upon a continent unknown to Europe, and a collision of worlds was about to begin. Part 2, Encounter and Conquest, 1492 to 1496. The world had changed, though no one yet understood how deeply. Columbus believed he had reached the Indies. The people he met, the islands he claimed, the cross he planted in foreign soil, all of it felt like the triumph of faith and courage. But history was already shifting beneath his feet. When dawn broke on that October morning, the sailors of the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria looked around them in awe. The air smelled of blossoms and earth instead of brine. Bright green forests lined the beaches. Parrots flashed through the trees like flying jewels. Naked men and women watched from a distance, their skin painted, their bodies adorned with feathers and shells. They were the Taino, gentle farmers and fishermen of the Caribbean, living in small villages ruled by local chiefs called caciques. Columbus approached them carrying banners and gifts, red caps, glass beads, small bells. The Taino greeted the strangers with wonder, offering fruit, parrots, and cotton thread. To Columbus, it was a sign of divine favor. In his journal he wrote, "They are loving people, without greed, and they will become Christians very easily." Yet behind his pious tone lurked another thought: these people could serve Spain. They could be converted, yes, but also commanded. He claimed the island for Ferdinand and Isabella and named it San Salvador. To the Taino it had always been Guanahani. He asked them where gold could be found, and they pointed south, to other islands where the yellow metal shone in the rivers. That single word, oro, became the obsession of every voyage that followed. The ships continued island hopping through the Bahamas and Cuba, and finally to a vast land Columbus called La Isla Española, Hispaniola, today Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There the landscape dazzled them, mountains cloaked in clouds, rivers teeming with fish, and villages filled with curious faces. Columbus was convinced he had reached the outskirts of Asia, perhaps near Japan or China. He imagined himself on the threshold of the fabled court of the Great Khan. But paradise held danger. The sea was treacherous, the maps non-existent. On Christmas Eve 1492, while Columbus slept, the Santa Maria struck a hidden reef and broke apart. With only 2 ships remaining, he salvaged the timbers and built a small fort on the northern coast. He named it La Navidad, Christmas. 39 men stayed behind, the first European settlement in the New World. They had food, weapons, and Taino allies. Columbus promised to return with reinforcements. In January 1493, he set sail for home aboard the Nina and Pinta. The Atlantic, however, was no friendlier on the return. Violent storms scattered the ships, the Nina nearly sank. In desperation, Columbus wrote a message describing his discovery, sealed it in wax, and cast it into the sea inside a barrel, hoping someone, anyone, might find it if he perished. But he survived. On March 15, 1493, after 7 months at sea, the battered little Nina limped into Palos harbor. The reception was explosive. Bells rang, crowds gathered, and news spread like fire across Europe: the Indies have been reached by sailing west. Columbus entered Barcelona in triumph, parading strange plants, brightly colored birds, and several Taino captives who were baptized in public ceremonies. Queen Isabella called him Don Cristobal Colón, Admiral of the Ocean Sea. His gamble had paid off, or so everyone thought. But glory breeds greed. The Spanish crown wanted more land, more gold, more souls. Within months Columbus was preparing a second voyage, this time a grand expedition, 17 ships, more than 1,000 men, horses, livestock, priests, and craftsmen. It was not an adventure now, it was an invasion. They sailed in September 1493, following the same path across the Atlantic. When they reached the Caribbean, the world seemed even more vibrant, islands dotted the horizon, teeming with birds and fruit. They called one Dominica, another Guadeloupe, another Montserrat. Yet when Columbus returned to La Navidad, he found only ashes. The fort was destroyed, and the men he had left behind were dead, killed after abusing the local Taino women and provoking retaliation. It was the first cycle of violence between Europe and the Americas, and it would not be the last. Shaken but determined, Columbus founded a new settlement, Isabella, on the north coast of Hispaniola. He dreamed of turning it into a model city of faith and prosperity, a gateway to Asia. Instead, it became a graveyard. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion tore through the settlers. The lush paradise they had imagined turned to misery. The gold they sought was scarce, the soil poor. Discontent grew. The Taino, once friendly, began to resist. They watched their land seized, their people enslaved to dig in riverbeds for gold that hardly existed. Columbus, desperate to prove success, imposed harsh policies. He ordered every Taino over 14 to deliver a small belful of gold every 3 months. Those who failed faced mutilation or death. Few could meet the demand. Villages fled into the mountains, others fought back with spears and stone. The Spaniards responded with steel. Meanwhile, storms destroyed crops and ships, and food ran short. The colonists mutinied, accusing Columbus of tyranny and incompetence. For the first time, the admiral's dream began to crumble. He had promised the monarchs wealth and glory, but the Indies yielded little but hardship. In letters home he begged for more supplies and complained that the settlers were unruly and thankless men. Still, he pressed deeper into the islands, exploring Cuba and Jamaica, convinced that the Asian mainland lay just beyond. He sketched rivers and mountains, sent home samples of exotic plants, and continued to take captives. The line between explorer and conqueror had vanished. By 1496, 4 years after that first triumphant voyage, Columbus finally sailed back to Spain. His beard was gray, his health failing, but his faith unbroken. He brought with him the news of new lands, vast territories ripe for colonization. Despite the disappointments, Ferdinand and Isabella welcomed him once more, though with colder smiles. The crown now knew these were not the wealthy kingdoms of Asia but something else entirely, lands filled with native nations who could be conquered, converted, or exploited. In the streets of Seville and Barcelona, people still cheered him as a hero. Yet behind the cheers lurked doubt. Had he really found the Indies? Or had he stumbled into something unknown? Maps began to fill with strange new shapes, long chains of islands, empty spaces labeled terra incognita. Columbus, ever stubborn, dismissed the skeptics. To the end of his days he would insist he had reached Asia, and that the great cities of Cathay lay just beyond the next island. But already the wheels of empire were turning. Other captains, Vespucci, Cabot, Balboa, Cortez, would soon follow the routes he had opened. And the gentle peoples he first encountered would soon face conquest on a scale they could not imagine. The dream of a westward path to Asia had become something else, a collision of worlds. As Columbus prepared for yet another voyage, the glory that once surrounded his name began to flicker. The New World was no longer a myth, it was a battlefield of ambition, faith, and greed. Part 3, Fall, Legacy, and the Shadow of the Admiral, 1498 to 1506 and beyond. By the time Columbus set out again in 1498, the dream that once glimmered like gold was beginning to tarnish. The Admiral of the Ocean Sea was still famous, still trusted by kings, but behind the titles lay exhaustion, doubt, and the first cracks of betrayal. His third voyage was meant to finally prove his grand theory, that the islands he discovered were the edge of Asia. This time, he sailed farther south than ever before, toward uncharted waters shimmering in equatorial heat. After weeks of storms and dead calm, the lookout cried out, "Land!" But this was not an island. It was a vast coastline, the mouth of a mighty river emptying into the sea. Columbus had reached the shores of South America, near what is now Venezuela. The sweet taste of the river water told him it flowed from a great continent. He marveled at its beauty, writing, "So beautiful is this land that I am sure it must be a part of paradise itself." Yet even as he gazed upon a new world, trouble waited behind him. When he returned to Hispaniola, he found the colony in chaos. Rebellion smoldered among the settlers, they accused him and his brothers of cruelty and corruption. The Taino population, once hundreds of thousands strong, had been devastated by disease, slavery, and despair. Fields lay empty, villages burned. The paradise he had promised Spain had become a place of death. The colonists demanded new leadership. Reports reached the Spanish court that the admiral ruled like a tyrant. In 1500, Ferdinand and Isabella sent a royal commissioner, Francisco de Bobadilla, to investigate. When Bobadilla arrived, he wasted no time, he ordered Columbus arrested. Shackles were clamped around the wrists of the man who had crossed the ocean and changed the world. The admiral was loaded onto a ship and sent back to Spain in chains. Imagine that voyage, Columbus sitting in his cabin, iron biting into his skin, the endless Atlantic outside his window. He was 50 years old, sick and weary, but still proud. When he reached Spain, the public gasped. The hero who had found the Indies, now a prisoner. The monarchs were embarrassed. They quietly ordered him freed and restored his honors, but the message was clear: his era of glory was over. New men, younger and hungrier, were taking his place. Still, the old sailor's fire had not gone out. In 1502, he convinced the crown to let him sail one last time. His fourth voyage was not about conquest but redemption. He called it his Voyage of Prophecy. He was convinced he would finally reach the fabled mainland of Asia and perhaps even Jerusalem by sailing west. He departed with 4 small ships and about 140 men, no settlers, no priests, no colonists, just explorers. They skirted the Caribbean, battered by hurricanes that shattered masts and tore sails to ribbons. In one storm, lightning struck so close that men fell to their knees, convinced the end had come. But Columbus pressed on, driven by something beyond reason, perhaps faith, perhaps pride, perhaps desperation. In June 1502, he reached the coast of Central America, modern Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. He explored harbors, spoke with native peoples, and heard rumors of a land of gold far to the west. But the jungle was merciless: heat, insects, and constant rain rotted food and gear. The ships, worm-eaten and leaking, could go no farther. When storms finally wrecked them on the coast of Jamaica in 1503, Columbus and his men were stranded for a year. They survived on what they could trade with local islanders, and on sheer willpower. At one point, when the locals refused to bring food, Columbus used his almanac to predict a lunar eclipse. On the appointed night, as the moon darkened blood-red, the Taino were terrified. Columbus declared that God was angry at them for withholding provisions. The frightened islanders begged forgiveness and resumed feeding the Spaniards. Even at his lowest, the admiral knew how to turn fear into power. Eventually, a rescue ship arrived. Columbus returned to Spain in 1504, ill, nearly blind, and forgotten. Queen Isabella, his greatest protector, died soon after. Without her, he had few allies at court. He spent his final years in Valladolid, dictating letters and still insisting he had reached the edge of Asia. In May 1506, Christopher Columbus died quietly, believing he had fulfilled his mission. He never realized he had discovered an entirely new world. He was buried simply, without fanfare. But his bones would not rest. They were moved from Spain to the Dominican Republic, then to Cuba, and back again. To this day, debate continues about where his remains truly lie, a fitting mystery for a man whose life was shaped by them. In the years after his death, his name became legend, and then controversy. The lands he reached were soon teeming with conquistadors hungry for gold and glory. Within a single generation, the great empires of the Aztec and Inca would fall. Millions of native peoples across the Americas would die from war, enslavement, and European diseases. The old world and the new were bound together, by trade, by conquest, by tragedy. Columbus had opened the door, but others decided what would walk through it. To Europeans, he was once a hero, the man who proved the world could be crossed, who connected continents and reshaped maps. Statues were raised, cities named, holidays declared. For centuries, he stood as a symbol of courage, exploration, and faith. But history is not made of one voice. For the descendants of the indigenous peoples he encountered, the story sounds very different. Columbus's arrival marked the beginning of centuries of loss, of land, of lives, of cultures silenced. The Taino themselves, the first to greet him, were nearly wiped out within decades. Today, their language survives only in echoes, words like hammock, canoe, and hurricane. Modern historians now see both sides. Columbus did not discover a new world, he connected two ancient ones. His voyage was both a triumph of human daring and a tragedy of human consequence. It was the spark that ignited global exchange, of plants, animals, people, and ideas, what scholars call the Columbian Exchange. From it came coffee, sugar, tobacco, horses, and smallpox. From it also came tomatoes, corn, and potatoes that transformed Europe forever. The world after Columbus would never again be isolated. His legacy is, in truth, the legacy of all humanity, ambition and curiosity intertwined with arrogance and cruelty. A mirror reflecting both our greatest bravery and our darkest impulses. Close your eyes and listen to the sea. Imagine those three small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, cutting across a horizon no one had dared to cross. Picture the faces of the sailors staring into the night, wondering if the edge of the world lay just beyond the next wave. They did not know what awaited them. Neither did he. Columbus's story is not just about one man. It's about what happens when vision meets ignorance, when faith meets power, when discovery meets destiny. He was a sailor, a dreamer, a prisoner, a prophet, and a man who changed the course of history. In the centuries that followed, millions would cross the same ocean, not as explorers, but as colonists, missionaries, merchants, and slaves. The world he revealed became the stage for conquest and creation, for suffering and hope. Out of that collision, modern America, and indeed, the modern world, was born. And so the tale of Christopher Columbus ends where it began, with the sea, vast, restless, eternal. The same sea that carried his dream carries our own. For better or worse, the horizon he chased is still out there, waiting for the next voyager brave, or foolish, enough to seek it. What are your thoughts on this topic? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, like and subscribe.